Will, Navdeep, good morning. It's very good to see you both.
Good morning.
We'll start this conversation about decision-making in the context of leadership, just perhaps by inviting both of you to introduce yourselves briefly so we know who's in the conversation. So Will, perhaps we can start with you.
Sure. My name is Will Harvey. I'm Professor of Management and Associate Dean at the University of Exeter Business School, and my research, teaching and consulting looks at the area of reputation, how organisations and individuals can build, manage, and in some cases rehabilitate their reputations.
Thank you, Will. Very good to have you with us. And Navdeep.
Good morning. This is Navdeep Aurora. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Exeter Business School, working with Will Harvey as my supervisor. The context of my PhD is an experience that I went through myself. I was indicted for professional misconduct and spent 18 months in an open prison in the United States. And previous to that, I was a senior partner with McKinsey & Company for 17 years and a partner with KPMG for 3 years. So our research reflects upon what drives individual professionals to commit professional misconduct, and how do they make decisions, with their individual context, the organizational factors and environmental factors bearing down at the same time.
Navdeep, thank you so much for that. And I know, as usual, we only have around 20 minutes for the conversation. So we would look forward to diving into some of the quite complex issues that you've raised. And thank you so much for taking the opportunity to join us in this conversation. So Navdeep, perhaps I can start with you. You were in a partner at McKinsey for many years, so you had a long professional career before the most recent events that you've alluded to. And in the context of decision making, perhaps you could just share with us some general observations, if you would, and around how you, as a senior, very senior manager in that organisation, thought about the decision making process. You were clearly involved in some very important decisions. What were the ways that you thought about this decision making in terms of making those decisions effective, in terms of the frameworks that you use, perhaps prior to the most recent events that you described, Navdeep?
Indeed. So I'll talk about. I'll quickly talk about the framework that all of us as business leaders are taught, the framework that is embedded in our DNA as business leaders to make decisions, and the default framework that results that we actually end up using as a result of the culture, the organizational culture, the organizational governance, the structures we are placed in, and the practices that are pervasive in our organizations. So I think there are 4 factors, organizational factors, that bear down, or when I look at my situation, that had a direct implication on how I made decisions and eventually made a massive mistake. And to contextualize that, let me make a statement here. In my opinion, McKinsey & Company is the most values-driven organization in the world, and I have worked with many organizations. I have not even come close to an organization that is more values and ethics driven. So the big question is, even within an organization with such strong values, what made me, or what pushed me to cross the line? That's the real question. And so the 4 factors are: the first one is culture. Within culture, the important bit is organizational values. And everybody talks about the importance of organizational values. I think what Will and I have found, that whilst most organizations talk about what the value is, there are not many who talk about, so what does it mean? They do not talk about the what and the how. So they say, yeah, we want to be, an organizational value is that we, our number one priority is client impact, but they stop there. They do not say, okay, but here's what it means. Here's how we drive impact, and here's how we do not drive impact. And so we believe that that organizational values need to come with a very fine set of guardrails, and those guardrails need to be very well defined. A prime example of this is my first day at McKinsey many years ago. At the end of the day, on the first day, we had a round table, a dinner with senior partners. There were 10 of us on each table and a senior partner. And the senior partner made an observation. He goes, out of the 10 of you, how many of you are the firstborns in your family? And 9 out of the 10 raised our hands. And he made an observation. He says, we have observed that firstborns tend to be the insecure overachievers, and that's the culture we promote. And that's line stayed with me all through my career. So
Navdeep, that's so fascinating, and what I've picked up from that is that you're very clear that this was a highly values-driven organization that you were part of, and your vast experience would attest to that, actually. But your point is that they talked the values, but what they didn't do enough of was translate that into action, both in terms of what you do and what you don't do, and when you say guardrails, I think you're meaning here are the lines that you don't cross as well, actually, and that's what those values actually mean for practice, and in terms of decision making, that was presumably also true of the way that decisions were made, were they, in terms of the values basis for decisions? Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Right.
I think you're spot on, and eventually what that does is, I think cost benefits become our default decision-making framework.
As opposed to values.
Exactly.
Value as opposed to values, I suppose.
Absolutely. And the problem, not a problem, but I think there are pros and cons to that, right? The con is that since that becomes our default decision-making framework, we apply that even to ethical decision-making. And unfortunately, ethical decisions are not as black and white as cost-benefit decisions.
So you lose the nuance, in a sense, that defines decision-making from an ethical perspective or an ethical framework.
Indeed.
I see.
And ethical decisions are not binary. Right. It's not. So and Will and I found that it's that it's that confusion that conflates ethical issues and becomes a big obstacle as we grow up within a certain culture, with a certain
confusion, Navdeep, and confusion in the sense of confusing the value versus values. In other words, confusing a cost-benefit analysis with things that actually have require a more thoughtful or more coloured perspective on a decision. That's really Navdeep, shall I just bring Will in on that point, because I know, Will, this is indeed your area of expertise and study. Is this something, I mean, Navdeep has talked about the particular example at McKinsey. Will, is this something that you're finding more generally in terms of ethical decision making in organizations? Will?
Yes, definitely. And one way to mitigate that problem that we've just been discussing, is to move decision making from an individual level, when there's grey areas, as you said, to a group level, because often if an individual is making decisions in difficult contexts where there is an ethical dimension, you know, they can warp or skew, you know, their own perspective on that. Whereas if you have a diverse set of people in a room making key decisions or helping that person to make decisions, and that can help to mitigate some of that risk, or at least to see a problem through another lens. So that's one way that you could mitigate. But I think this is actually a wider societal phenomenon. So there's been a proliferation of discussion about the purpose of organizations. And obviously values is really the actions and behaviors that organizations adopt to kind of fulfill that purpose. But in my experience, in many organizational contexts, it's a window dressing exercise. It's something that's written on stationery, on glass, on notice boards, for instance. But the true testament to values actually being embedded within an organization is where you see those actions and behaviors actually reflecting those values. And you see managers and leaders reinforcing those values, both positively when they're enacted, but also challenging when they're not enacted. And that's where you know that those values are really true to that organization.
That's really interesting, Will. So this is Navdeep's point about, you know, you can talk about an organization as being highly values driven, but actually the proof in the pudding is is not what they put on their notice boards, but actually what you see managers actually doing or not doing in certain cases. So that reflects Navdeep's. But you made the fascinating point about, isn't it true that decision making is often perhaps misinterpreted as being a very individual process, but your point is actually, particularly when ethics are involved, and perhaps that's true of most decisions, actually, particularly at the senior level, that actually we should think of it as a group process, or there ought to be a process by which decisions are referred to a wider audience to avoid or to minimize ethical issues. Is that's the other point that you're making? Is that correct?
Yes, and I would just really emphasize that is not the same thing as adding another layer of bureaucracy or decision making. It's not having an additional chain of command where it gets delegated down. What it means is having a diverse set of people who can inform, challenge, discuss some of those decisions in a face-to-face and meaningful way. Not, oh, I'll delegate this to another person who delegates it to another person. It just gets lost in a sea of bureaucracy, because I think they can seem similar, but actually they're subtly quite different in terms of bureaucracy versus bringing in a wider set of opinions to important ethical decisions.
Indeed, and also in terms of hierarchy, because often people are reluctant to challenge decisions for hierarchical or power mechanisms. So you're talking about actually permission, I think, also to reflect on, challenge, question decision-making process. That sounds like a critical organizational process, actually, that would allow organizations to ensure that decisions are being taken with more of an ethical perspective, I guess, would be one way of summing it. Is that right? Well, that's fascinating. I think perhaps we switch back to Navdeep, because Navdeep was just bringing us up, I think, Navdeep, to the point where you've set the context for us, I think, really nicely in the organization that you were working in, and also talking a bit about the way that they were approaching values. And you've led us up, I think, to the point where I think you said you made a critical mistake. Is that right? So Navdeep, would you mind talking us through that? Is that okay? And what led you to that, and what the thought processes were, Navdeep?
Indeed. So I'll specifically talk about the mistake I made. So as I mentioned, I was there for 17 years. And at McKinsey, you have a very, it's actually a very, where what McKinsey called, one of the values is called caring meritocracy, which is, your progress within the firm is based on, what McKinsey calls up or out, or grow or go. And every 6 months you're evaluated, and you're either told that you are moving up or you're moving on. And even if you move on, the firm's behind you and supportive, and you're part of this big global network. And so the firm has a very caring perspective on meritocracy. So in your career, you go through the two biggest inflection points. First is your election to a partnership, and then the most important one is your election to a senior partner, which is sort of a tenure track, lifelong thing. But so I became a partner in 2003. And then, I was highly motivated on my journey to become a senior partner. And this happened around 2007, 2008, where I was working, where I actually was working with a client in the US on a long-term performance transformation. I was leading that. And to me, personally, that was my ticket to becoming a senior partner. So I was sort of in the window, or I would have been in the window in the next couple of years. During the project, one of the middle-level client managers came to me, and we had some technology implementation work, which during those days, McKinsey were never involved in technology implementation. And the client said, why don't you, find some external vendors? So we found some external vendors. It was 8 small projects that added up to $687,000. Whilst we were going through this process, one of the client team managers came up to me and said, my brother-in-law is in the armed forces, just back from a tour of duty to Afghanistan. And he's a technologist, has started an IT firm, and we like to give work to ex-military personnel. He says, can you award him the work? And my first reaction was, no, we cannot. It has to go through the proper RFP process, and he's very welcome to bid on the process. And then as a result, he walked away a bit angry and disgruntled. And so that should have been the end of it, but no. Next 2 days, I could not sleep. And what went through my brain was, what if this upsets the client, and our engagement with this company is derailed? What will happen to my career? And I took it, I think to me, mentally, it became a decision of whether this was a go or no go for whether I will have the opportunity to ever be elected a senior partner in the firm. And that fear of not being able to achieve my dream, the fear of losing what I had achieved, is what pushed me to eventually, after 2 days, go back and award the project to his brother-in-law. And everything went fine. And actually, this is another part which I like to raise. Everything was finished in 2010. I was elected a senior partner. Everything would have gone well. In 2013, I left McKinsey, joined KPMG. And in the meantime, somehow that company found out that only 6 out of the 8 technology projects had actually been delivered. Only 2 had been delivered. The other 6 had been billed and paid for. And unfortunately, they had all come to my desk for final signatures. And they'd come, and I had assumed that they had been paid and signed them off. So that was the mistake I made, and finally resulted in my professional misconduct charges.
Navdeep, thank you. And thank you for recounting that story to us. It's so fascinating to get your insights into what happened over those critical few decisions that you made, and clearly the mistakes that you made. Would you perhaps therefore now take us to the point about why you think that happened? I mean, I think it's kind of emerged a little bit from the context that you gave us, I think, but it would be really good if you could make that a little more explicit and just share with us why you believe that happened, just having had much time to think about it and study it, of course.
Sure, absolutely. So I think what you're raising is a very interesting point, which says, and your point is, why Navdeep? Why is it that the vast majority of us do not fall into these traps, right? Why are few people? And so all of us face very similar organizational pressures. All of us are subject to similar environmental constraints, right? But why is it that only a handful of us fall prey to this, right, and cross the lines? This was really the focus of Will and my research, where we interviewed over the course of the 18 months that I spent in the prison. We interviewed 70 inmates, white collar inmates, who were in prison, who serving sentences for crimes very similar to mine. And what we found was that there are 6 triggers, individual triggers, that lead people to cross the line. And these triggers are, the first one is burden of custodianship. Burden of custodianship is basically a perceived responsibility for diverse stakeholders, and our own construed image and perception that we are feeling to meet their expectations. It puts a level of pressure on us that can cause us to cross the line.
Interesting, Navdeep. And if I may, Navdeep, in your case, it was the pressure that you felt from McKinsey in terms of your the risk to your promotion to senior partner, and the burden presumably that you also felt from your client. And I guess were those the 2 burdens that you felt, the risk of losing the client, and those of course were associated. Is that how that applied in your particular case? Is that correct?
Absolutely,
right.
Absolutely. Now to going back to Will's point earlier, had I been smart enough at that time, and I had taken the time to talk to my colleagues or talk to my family, right? They would have obviously said, no, Navdeep, what you're thinking about doing is not right, right? But what happens is, this is another interesting point, when we are faced with pressure, intuition takes over our judgment. And that's what creates these type of blind spots.
And that's a bad thing, is it, Navdeep? Because it's often talked about intuition, to talk about just the decision-making process in general, that obviously facts and evidence is almost a kind of necessary condition for decision-making, but it's often felt that actually a sufficient condition is also intuition, in a sense, your experience, your sixth sense, the thing that it seems like the right or wrong thing to do. But you're saying in this case that was the wrong thing to do, is that right? I'm just interested to hear your perspective on that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think when we are faced with these type of situations, I think the real question is, how are things designed to work versus how people actually behave at the moment of pressure.
In the moment of truth.
At the moment of truth, indeed. And you know, as we discussed earlier, when, you know, excessive controls and compliance, it, you know, puts so much pressure on us. And then you combine that with environmental factors, organizational factors. When we face this pressure, as human beings, we tend to isolate ourselves.
Mm.
And so going back to Will's point about group decision making, but a complicating factor is that behaviorally, that doesn't come naturally to us. We feel, you know, I felt that, oh, I was a partner, right? It was up to me. It was the burden of custodianship was mine. I had to find a solution, and I didn't want to depend upon anybody else, right? It was my decision to make. Mm-hmm. And so I isolated myself, which is what created this pressure, this cognitive dissonance, and judgment sort of fell through. Intuition took over, and I made the wrong decision.
That's fascinating. It's almost the dark side of that. You know, we all know that leadership can be quite lonely, and this is where you're saying, actually, don't make it so lonely. Actually, you know, do ask other people. And Will, do you want to come in on that point?
Yeah,
fascinating. Will?
Yeah, I was going to say that coming back to your question about intuition, I think if you have the luxury of time, then you need to create that time to consult with others. Now, obviously, you know, if you're in the theatre as a surgeon, or if you're in the field in a military combat, then of course intuition, you have to make a decision. You may not have the luxury of consulting others, but I think that's quite different from the context that Navdeep is describing, where even though he may have felt the pressure, he didn't actually have the immediate pressure of time against him. And there are actually two sort of significant moments. There was the moment where he went back and allocated the award to that person, but then there was also that signing off of those contracts to also reflect and think about, well, maybe I should consult others just to find out what has been happening in regard to those projects that we've funded. And that is just, again, creating the time to consult with others to ensure that the decision you're making, either to award a contract or to sign something off, is supported by the evidence and the conversations you've had with others.
So one of the key lessons, Will, is that sometimes, a couple of things actually. Probably, sometimes maybe you feel you have less time than you actually have. That sort of like create the time to have that consultation and understand that you may be at that key moment where your judgment perhaps has been called into question, and to understand and realize that and involve others in that process at that critical moment, and avoid that feeling that you have to do it yourself, sort of thing. I suppose is that have I reflected that correctly?
Exactly. You have to do it. Understanding you don't necessarily have to do it yourself, and you don't necessarily have to do it yourself now.
Great. Thanks, Will. And I'd come back to Navdeep, because Navdeep, I'm conscious that you said there were probably a few factors that, in answer to the question why, and I just want to make sure that we've explored all of the key ones. Navdeep.
Indeed. So we talked about the burden of custodianship. The second factor is fear of failure, which is driven by a need for self-preservation, the fear of losing our own reputation, and in a small percentage of cases, financial incentive. And this is another one of the insights that came out, that typically, I think, typically greed is referred to as the most significant driver of unethical decisions or professional misconduct. And in our opinion, it wasn't greed. Our research shows that greed is over-exaggerated as a driver. Only 10% of our participants actually, were driven by greed or financial incentive as a primary motive. So that's the second key factor. The third key factor is what we call ego and hubris. And ego and hubris results from a record of success in the recent past, from opportunity and timing, and from perceived invincibility. Right? We start to believe that we are parts of these elite organizations, and that we set the rules in the industry and nobody can touch us. And that's a feeling that sets into us over time.
Indeed. I don't know whether you're a student of Greek tragedy, but I think Aeschylus would have had a few things to say about that, indeed. So in terms of hubris, so leading yourself to believe that you are in fact invincible, and that your judgment is superior, and pride goes before a fall, I guess, was the so that's another insight. So Navdeep, please continue. There are other factors that you've said.
Yes, indeed. The fourth one is overcompensation for perceived deficiencies. And what we noticed was that a very significant percentage of our participants had some record of personal tragedy or grief in their life, a record of where they were not happy, right? And the behaviors and decisions they had made or undertaken were a proxy for perceived shortcomings. I mean, I can actually personally relate to myself, which is I grew up as a child. I grew up, in a very, my parents were school teachers, right? And I grew up in a lower middle class family, and always pushed to excel. And to me, there was nothing more important than showing my parents and everybody else that I can be successful. I had some physical ailments that kept me away from physical activity. So academic excellence became my ticket to my own freedom, right? And so I think a lot of the actions I took here, were a proxy to show myself mentally that I could do it.
I see.
The fifth one is a lack of information capacity and capability to respond to mistakes. And I think our observation has been that the boundaries, the regulatory boundaries, are shifting so quickly that it actually creates a lot of confusion at times vis-a-vis what is wrong and what is not wrong, what is legal and what is actually on the verge of illegal. So there are several examples. Physicians who were practicing pain medication in certain states in the US, they were permitted by state regulations the use of opioids. But then suddenly, due to political headwinds, opioids became a big no-no, and the usage was declared a federal crime. So there were people who were sent to prison because what they were doing was a crime federally, but not a crime in their local state. So that's
in certain circumstances, it's just becoming harder and more complex to work out what in fact is correct or legal and not legal. That's really interesting. And I think was there a sixth, Navdeep, as well?
Yes, the sixth one was very unique personal beliefs and values, and this was in a small percentage of people. These were people who still, even after having spent 1, 3, and sometimes 10, 11 years in prison, believed that they had not done anything wrong, that they had never tried to harm anyone, and the government had no right to actually impose taxes on them, that they were what I would call a quote unquote a sovereign nation on their own, and even when they're released, they will continue to fight their cause.
So and in your case, in regard to that sixth attribute?
I beg your pardon. No, in my case, I think I have, and I did even before my sentencing. I openly admitted, right, that I had made a mistake. What I did was absolutely unethical, unprofessional, and I deserved punishment for what I had done.
Thank you, Navdeep. And is there any difference that you've observed in terms of why you came to that conclusion and that others don't, that they still believe the fact that what they did was right?
Yes, indeed. And as I mentioned, the percentage of people who came out, came out of this ordeal or process believing that they hadn't done it was very small. Only 7 to 8% of the 70 participants that we interviewed. But the difference, I think I would say that I think the difference between these people would be that I think some of them were, as I mentioned, were operating under boundaries that were very unclear. Right. So, for instance, I'll give you an example of a very, very successful cannabis farmer who was in his state growing and selling cannabis in a certain form was legal. It was illegal federally. He was charged for 4 years, sent to prison for 4 years, and here's the interesting bit. By the time he'll be released, cannabis would become legal federally. So he would have spent 4 years in prison for something that is no longer a punishable crime. So
which illustrates your point about how the complexity of rules changing in terms of Navdeep, thank you so much for that, and I'm conscious of our time. We have overrun. I'm sure our viewers will forgive us on this occasion for being able to give us such a fascinating story and give so many insights into the process and the experience that you've had, Navdeep. So thank you for that. And perhaps we could finish. Well, perhaps I could bring you back in, Will, and could I ask you a very specific question from your research and from your expertise? If people listening to this who think, well, what is the key lesson from this in your view in terms of the ethics of decision making that people should take away from it? Well,
yeah, I think Navdeep touched upon it, and it's to understand that the decisions that we make are made within an individual, an organizational, and an environmental context. So we all have that footprint, but each of us has a different footprint. We all bring our own individual baggage. We all work within a different environmental context, and we all work in different organizations. And even within an organization, as we know, there can be microcultures within particular teams or units, for example. So for a leader or for a manager, I think the take home is to really try and understand the context in which the people that are reporting into you or working around you come to the table. So understand their individual circumstances. You need to understand, well, what is the kind of the microculture within that particular team that you're operating? And what's the environmental or regulatory context? So, for instance, Navdeep's given that example of the cannabis farmer, but actually it's far broader than that. If you think about the gray lines between tax avoidance versus tax evasion, you think about how people use data and commercialize it in particular ways. There are lots and lots of areas where 1 minute you're celebrated and rewarded for being innovative, and in other areas you've crossed some kind of ethical or even legal line. So I guess my summary would be to really try and recognize that people aren't innately bad or good. People make decisions within their own individual context that also is affected by the wider environment and the wider either organizational or team culture that they operate within.
Will, thank you so much for that. Some really interesting insights that perhaps we can use as a conclusion to our fascinating discussion. I'm conscious that we have overrun this time, but hopefully colleagues will forgive us for being able to explore such interesting insights from both of you, Will Harvey and Navdeep Aurora. So it just remains for me actually to thank you both on behalf of the TEDR Academy and the Lincoln International Business School for your time today in exploring such a fascinating topic with us. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.